So the Bible then almost come at last if they would be truly wise in spiritual things. So if all we do when we look at current events is just update ourselves on what's happening around the world, or we might just as well read a newspaper. We've got to think about those things from a spiritual point of view. And as we look at the words of Christ and of our Heavenly Father, the inspired record of his word, which tells us, at least in broad terms and sometimes quite specifically, what we can look forward to, then we do have reason to lift up our heads and take heart, because surely the return of Christ is near. And it's interesting that he says in verse 26, men's hearts are failing them for fear. If that wasn't happening before, it's certainly starting to happen now, for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. So even people in general would look upon things coming on the earth, those things which are beginning to take place, and would be concerned about that, seriously concerned. And so he uses that expression, things which are coming, a number of times in this record. It's there again in verse 28, when these things begin to come to pass. In verse 31, when you see these things come to pass. So this isn't now just the people of the world generally looking with trepidation on what's taking place in the world. Here are the saints, the followers of the Lord Jesus Christ. When we see those things come to pass, know ye that the kingdom of God is nigh at hand. And then again in verse 36, watch and pray always, that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all these things that shall come to pass, and to stand before the Son of Man. So there's an emphasis from the Lord Jesus Christ himself about those things which were to come. If we go back to Matthew chapter 16, we'll just read it on the screen here. The Pharisees and the Sadducees came and tempted him, desiring him that he would show them a sign from heaven. And he said a number of things, but in the end he said, you hypocrites, you can read the sky, you can tell what the weather's going to be by just looking up in the heavens and observing that. You can discern the face of the sky. Well, how come you can't discern the signs of the times? And so when we talk about the signs of the times, that's the passage that we are talking about, or that we get that expression from. And Luke chapter 21, we read a lot, we think about it a lot, and with good reason, because it's an exciting chapter for Christian Elfins to read, or it ought to be. In verse 25, he said that there would be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, in the political arena, and upon the earth there would be distress of nations with perplexity, that word which we know means without a way, without any avenue of escape, just perplexing, just people looking at that and saying, well, what on earth do we do now? There's no answer. For the powers of heaven shall be shaken, and men's hearts would fail for fear, and the sea and the waves would be roaring. Where does he get that expression from? The sea and the waves talks about nations in turmoil. That's our understanding of that. Anyone think of an expression or a passage in Scripture where that sort of terminology is used? Yes, Peter?
Isaiah 17, verse 12.
Yeah, what does that say?
Jeremiah 51.
What does that say?
It lines it up with
Yeah, okay. There's a number of passages, Isaiah 57, I think, that the nations are like a troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. It's another one. Revelation, we have a number of passages. So the sea and the waves are going to be roaring, and we can see that now, where people just are wondering, where are we going in this world, and don't have an answer. In verse 26, men's hearts would be failing them for fear and for looking after those things that are coming on the earth. The powers of heaven shall be shaken. There'll just be turmoil in the political heavens of this world, and so it's turning out to be. It's been that way for quite a while, but it's just things piling on top of one another. And then he spoke to them that parable. Behold the fig tree a symbol of Israel, the nation of Israel, and that expression is used a number of times in the Old Testament in relation to Israel. But it's not just the fig tree, it is behold the fig tree and all the trees. So if we look at the situation from the end of the Second World War onwards, so that war ends in 1945, 1948 we've got the state of Israel, so there's the budding forth of the fig tree, the shooting forth of that tree, but all the trees. Well over 60 nations have been newborn, as it were, since the end of the Second World War. Behold the fig tree and all the trees. Well, there's a sign. You look at the fig tree, you look at the trees, and when they start to shoot forth, well, there's a sign. You can read that sign of the times in the natural order of things. You'll see that summer is now nigh at hand. So likewise, know this, that when these things come to pass, when there is the shooting forth of the fig tree and all the trees, and at the same time as that's happening, there's roaring in amongst the powers of heaven, sea and the waves roaring. And as that's happened, men's hearts are failing them for fear. Then as all of those things come together, that's the time for you to look up and to be excited. But then he says in verse 34, take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. And so he's given us a number of signs to watch for, and so these are the things that are going to be coming to pass, but just be careful, because it may very well be that you, my followers, might be engaged in these things, overcharged with surfeiting, involved in the things of this life, looking to see how we can better our circumstances in this world. Time to upgrade the motor car, do up the house, do all sorts of things. And even worse, might be overcharged with drunkenness and the cares of this life. We could end up in an even worse situation if we involve ourselves not with the ecclesia and our brothers and sisters, but with our friends in the world perhaps, or at work. So watch out for that, he says. Don't let that day come upon you unawares. He talked about that day before, a few chapters back in Luke 17, when he's spoken about the days of Christ and the day of the Son of Man. Well, that day is going to come. Be careful, he says. Take heed to yourselves. Don't just look around, look inwardly. Engage in some introspection, some self-examination. Consider what's happening in your own life. What are you letting yourself get away with in the last days? Because we're really not going to get away with anything. As a snare it's going to come on all them that dwell on the face of the whole earth. Watch ye therefore. So look at all the things coming to pass. Look at these signs that I've given you. Then take heed to yourself and then watch. So look inwards and then be alert and watch. Pray that ye may be accounted worthy to escape all those things and stand before the Son of Man. So there's a perspective there, a context for us to think about as we look at what is taking place in the world. And so, well, what about Israel first? There's the fig tree shooting forth. Now, for those of us, and there's a few in this room who can look back to 1967, the Six-Day War. That was only 50-something years ago. And when that was all taking place, that amazing event, and we were watching it all happen, and I was only a bit of a kid at the time, we thought there can't be too many years to go. 10 years? Nah, couldn't possibly be that long before Christ returns. And here we are, and 50 years or so has passed. And one of the things that we've got to watch and take heed to as we look at ourselves is that we don't say, my Lord delays his coming. So I can engage in a little bit of that sort of behaviour that we read about, that we need to take heed of. So there's Israel. When the Six-Day War took place, Israel was a fairly poor country. It wasn't a country where people had much of the good things of life. It wasn't a wealthy nation, but today That's changed dramatically. That has absolutely changed dramatically. Well, Ezekiel suggested to us in Ezekiel 38, not only all those other things that we take out of Ezekiel 38, but just looking at what the record says about the state of Israel and the circumstances of it, we can see that here is a nation which is not doing too badly at all. So in verse 8 of Ezekiel 38, after many days thou shalt be visited, in the latter years thou shalt come into the land that is brought back from the sword, is gathered out of many people against the mountains of Israel, which used to be always waste. The implication is not so anymore. It's brought forth out of the nations, and they shall dwell safely or securely or confidently in that land, all of them. Well, you don't live securely or with a sense of safety, generally, in that place in the middle of the Middle East, with all the hostility all around, unless you're in a pretty good situation. It's, verse 11, a land of unwalled villages, where people dwell at rest, that dwell securely. And they dwell without walls and having neither bars or gates. They're not in a bad state, really. And verse 13 tells us that this northern power will come with a purpose, to take a spoil, a prey, silver, gold, cattle, goods. More than that, all of those things together, a great spoil. So Israel will be a wealthy nation. And so today it is, remarkably so. So in the realm of agriculture, there's a map, and you may not be able to see it too clearly. If I was sitting up the back, it'd just be a bit of a blur to me, but fortunately I've got it in front of me. So there's a map which just shows the sorts of agricultural elements that apply in the land. The dark green territory, if you can see that clearly, is mostly orchards. You can see little spots of green up around Tel Aviv, down in the south in the Negev, and along the borders of Gaza, to the east and to the north. The red which is there to indicate greenhouse crops. And the lighter green areas is pasturage, fields and cropping. There's just a few pictures. There's the greenhouse at work. Just amazing things have been done so that people from India and all over the world, people are just flocking to Israel to say, how can we get our agriculture to the standard that yours is in this tiny country? Now, it wasn't so long ago, 2 or 3 years, really, only a few years, that we were reading about Israel being in drought, about the water coming from the Sea of Galilee down the Jordan, had so much draw upon that there was hardly anything dribbling out at the bottom end of the funnel, that they were in dire straits. But again, that circumstance has changed, and Israel now has all the water they need. They've got excess water, if you like. They're sending water to Palestine and across the border to a degree to Jordan to supplement their situation. And now they've built, so far, 5 major desalination plants along the Mediterranean coast. From Ashkelon in the south, you can see them there. Ashkelon, Ashdod, Palmachim, Sorek, Hadera, which is near Tel Aviv in the north or the mid-north. And down the bottom in the middle there, you'll see until 2013, when these were starting to come online, they had the capacity for 600 million cubic metres per year. MCM stands for million cubic metres. And try and picture that. I tried to picture it. I was sitting at my desk the other day thinking a metre by a metre by a metre, and think about 1 million. It wouldn't take too many to drown me in that study. And 600 million cubic metres. And by next year, they're saying 750 million cubic metres per year will come from those facilities. Not only that, there's a schematic, that little pie chart, which tells us approximately how much water they use in a year 2,076 million cubic metres, and they're considerate enough to devote 23.4 million cubic metres for nature, I guess, just to splash around the countryside in the parks and gardens and so forth. So the orange is domestic use. 35% of the total water availability in Israel goes to domestic use, 733 million cubic metres. Small amount, 6.7% relatively, 138 million cubic metres to industry. And then that green section is the largest, 58%, 1,205 million cubic metres a year for agriculture. And you'll see the sort of grey bar going around the outside, and that's the thing tells us that's recycled and brackish water. Israel recycles well over 80% of all of the water that they use domestically and industrially. It's the highest in the world by a long, long way. Australia is about 5%, I think, between 5 and 10, very low, over 80%. So a huge percentage of the water that they use in one application can then be reused for agricultural and other purposes. And of course they still have, when it does rain, they get a bit of water from that, and the water which comes down the Jordan, they have the national water carrier, the main pipelines channeling that water all through the country. And so their position has just changed dramatically, so that water is now not a concern. When they used to have restrictions and all sorts of problems, those problems are gone. They got more water than they know what to do with, because they planned for it and executed the plan, and that's how you get things done. So Israel's economy, there's the graph from 2012 up to 2022. Well, obviously the last 2 or 3 years on that graph are what they think the projections will end up being. Nobody knows what's going to happen tomorrow, but they think they do. GDP per capita at the moment, $43,000 per head. GDP growth in the last year was 4.4%. It's one of the highest rates of increase in GDP in the world. America is boasting about having a phenomenal result of 3.1 or 3.2% for 2018. It's one of the best results they've had for quite a few years. Well, Israel's well ahead of that. Despite some of the good things that are happening and the wealth that the country is enjoying, there's still just over 20% of the population that lives below the poverty line. They've got some very poor Arab communities, some of the Jewish immigrants from a number of countries who haven't shared the wealth. Total GDP for this year, they estimate at $391 billion. They're in the top 3 in the diamond industry in the world, together with Belgium and India, the other two. And the diamond industry represents 23% of their total exports. Arms sales, Israel is the 7th largest exporter of arms in the world. That's not something we might boast about, but it's a major contributor. They are the 4th now in the OECD in oil and gas reserves, not so much in the oil reserves, although there's some promising things happening. But of course in the gas reserves we're well aware that the offshore gas fields have been found in the last 10 years, and most of them have come on stream. There's one major field to come on stream, I think, next year, and Israel will be self-sufficient in gas for the foreseeable future. The Leviathan field is the one which will be producing from next year, and that's the biggest of them all. So now they're exporting gas. So it's becoming a major export earner for Israel. So that fig tree has shot forth. The Golan Heights, what's happening there? Well, there's been a significant oil find in the Golan Heights. The oil-bearing strata, normally for most oil fields around the world, is about 5 or so metres in depth. The one that they've found, according to the analysis that they've done, is about 300 metres. It's a huge field if it can be developed. It's said to be sufficient to supply Israel to keep them going in oil for a number of decades. if it's developed. There's been no development yet because there are some serious political issues to handle. And we have the EU and a number of other countries really complaining about this and saying, well, this isn't right, you shouldn't develop those fields because that's in Syrian territory, which you just happen to be occupying. Well, right now in the United States, some of the Republicans are putting forward legislation, draft legislation, to recognise Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, to make that formally recognised Israeli territory. So, well, bad luck, Syria, you lost. It's now our territory. And for those who stand on the hills of the Golan Heights, that was where, a few years ago, the Syrians, with their tanks, looked down over all of the northern area of Israel from those commanding heights, which gave them an enormous advantage. If it hadn't been for the tenacity and divine providence which gave Israel a victory in that circumstance, and they took that territory. You can't see it, but if you expand this map and sort of widen it up, right at the very top, you see Mount Hermon, and that little the wording there says Mount Hermon ski lift. So up there in the snows of Hermon, Israel's now got a ski lift going. It's part of the wealth of their nation. If they do take over that territory, and they've shifted 20,000 settlers into there already, so that their plan is to change the demographics, because the Druze community had a significant population in the Golan Heights, still do, but Israel's plan is to create a new reality on the ground, that is of Jewish population superiority in that area. So they've got over 20,000 there already, and their plan is in fairly short time to have over 100,000. So just to make that a reality, to say, well, just as Russia has done in a number of in the periphery of their area of influence, said, well, we've got a majority of ethnic Russians in Crimea, for example, and they do, 60 to 65% ethnic Russians in that area. And so they took that as one of their major justifications for saying, well, we've inquired of these people and they say they want us to control it, so look out Ukraine, we're coming in, and they just took it over a few years ago. So the end result of them trying to develop those significant fields, and of course once you find oil, everyone wants to get in on it. There could be war with Syria, and of course the Russians are there now as well, and the Iranians. So perhaps a further addition to Israeli wealth potentially in the years ahead, if our Lord does not return very soon. Something else that we've seen over the last few years is a degree of cooperation between Israel, Egypt, Jordan, the Emirates to a degree, working together. This fellow, General Yair Golan, Deputy Commander of Israeli Armed Forces, spoke of an unprecedented level of cooperation, mainly regarding intelligence. When the Gaza battles were taking place a few years ago, then Israeli intelligence and Egyptian and Jordanian were talking every day about what was happening there, exchanging information. Just something that would have been unheard of a few years ago. Well, I won't read all of that massive type there, but the reality is that since the Lebanese war and since the war in Gaza, there has been a rearmament from Iran in particular and others as well, so that Lebanon, the Hezbollah group in Lebanon in particular, have now got tens of thousands of missiles aimed at Israel, more than they've ever had before, by a long way. And not just like a backyard firecracker where you stick it in the bottle, light the fuse and it goes off and goodness knows where it's going to go. That was almost the level of technology behind the rockets that Lebanon or the Hezbollah were firing about 8 years ago. But these I'll just read this little section. It says, the worst news is that these rockets are being turned into smart rockets. The Iranians took the Zilzal-2, whatever that is, turned it into a guided rocket. The third generation of it contains a homing sensor and a GPS. And the commentators, the Israeli commentators say, well, these guided missiles with significant warhead capacity could be devastating to Israel if thousands of missiles come floating down upon them. Now, I won't go through that. That's some of the Hezbollah missiles of all sorts, a lot of them used by Iran as well. And of course they say, well, there's the Iron Dome defence. And if you sort of follow some of the things which have been happening when Hamas in Gaza fires these missiles into Israel, we say, oh, it was shot out of the sky by Iron Dome. And what the Israelis do, they've got a radar unit, a sensor. They can see that missile as soon as it's fired. They see the trajectory of it. They can calculate with their battlefield computers, that's going to land at this GPS point. That's in the open fields. We'll let that one go. But if the trajectory is taking it into populated area, they'll try to shoot it down, and mostly they do. Been very successful at that. Just a schematic of how it works. They've now got the David's Sling missile defence from the US, and that's for use against tactical, ballistic, medium to long-range rockets and cruise missiles. Well, that's fine. You know, if you've got a few dozen of these David Sling missiles, but what happens if somebody fires 200 of the things at you? What do you do then? And the comment is that the sheer volume of missiles available to Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, with Iranian support, may simply overwhelm Israel's defences in a major battle. That they've got these very slick defence missiles, and they'll be successful in many cases, but there's just too many. And they get overwhelmed by that, or could potentially be overwhelmed by that if the same circumstance happened again. There was another war with Hezbollah and Hamas together. You might have seen those pictures of the sand hills of Tel Aviv with a small group standing around. And then a few years later, in 1922, the city's under development. And that's Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv in 1922. And things are moving along. Well, along Rothschild Boulevard now, that's what we're looking at. Tel Aviv, of course, is a major city in Israel, the biggest city, and it's just like any modern, wealthy city. Along the seafront, we've got all the towers for the well-to-do to have their holidays, looking out over the beach, and the commercial areas like this. So there's been a major change. The fig tree has shot forth amazingly. Just to summarise, Israel's wealth. Israel's the 6th wealthiest people in the Middle East and Asia. The average Israeli is as wealthy as the average European, if not more so, according to Credit Suisse. And this is exciting. Up to a quarter of Israeli income takes place in the black economy, unreported to tax authorities. Well, that's got to help the economy, doesn't it? The tax people don't like it very much, but I shouldn't be speaking in support of such terrible things, especially being a tax agent. Israel apparently now has 18 billionaires measured in US dollars and approximately 80,000 high net worth individuals with assets in excess of 5 million. So it's become a significant industrial, commercial, agricultural power. Their main industries, the high tech, they've got an area, they don't call it Silicon Valley, they call it Silicon Wadi. And Israel is the 2nd largest area in the world, second to Silicon Valley in south of San Francisco, and more startups than just about anyone else. Amazing the development that's taken place. Diamond cutting, agriculture, energy, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and arms sales. So there they are. Silver and gold are great spoil. This is an amazing country. But we know it's not going to go on. Russia and its allies will in the end come against Israel. The king of the north shall come against him. To bear the name of the king of the north today, and whatever power bears that name must resume control over the king of the north territory, which includes Syria. And of course there we've got Russian forces, troops, air force, naval forces in Syria just on the borders of Israel. Quite amazing. Here was a meeting which took place in Sochi. Remember that was where the Winter Olympics were held a couple of years ago? It's like Russia's Miami Beach, the Black Sea warm weather resort. The fancy boats and fancy buildings. And into that city went Rouhani of Persia, Putin of Russia, and Erdogan of Turkey. Just a couple of weeks ago. And they had their fourth meeting to consider what are we going to do in this area where we now have significant power and responsibility and control. I mean, who runs Turkey today? Or not Turkey, who runs Syria today? Well, they have a notional head, but the real power behind the throne is Iran and Russia. And in the north, Turkey. And there they are. So, things that are staggering for us to see developing in the last few years. Ezekiel, of course, in Ezekiel 38, I just went to town here just to establish that, yes, Prince of Rosh is the correct pronunciation because all of the major translations translated that way. Chief Prince means the Prince of Rosh, the one at the top, the head. And the name Rosh, Gesenius says, it's a proper noun of a northern nation mentioned with Tubal and Meshach, undoubtedly the Russians, he says. No doubt about it in his mind. Who were mentioned by Byzantine writers of the 10th century under the name the Rus, dwelling to the north of Taurus, described by Ibn Foslin, an Arabic writer of the same age as dwelling on the river Ra or the Volga. The Encyclopaedia Britannica says the name Russia is derived through Rossiya from the Slavonic Rus or Ross. And if you read some history books about Russia, that's what you'll find. So it's identified by name in Ezekiel 38, it's identified by location. And we don't need to look them up because there it is in front of us. In Ezekiel 38 verse 15, King James Version translation says, "Thou shalt come from thy place out of the north parts." The NASB says out of the remote parts of the north. The RSV says out of the uttermost parts of the north. So where is it? To the north, it would be my guess. And of course there's Russia, the northernmost significant power in the world. And if we take the line of longitude through Jerusalem, follow it due north. Well, you don't go through the centre of Moscow, but you go through the outskirts of Moscow. Due north of Israel, due north of Jerusalem, is this power in the uttermost parts of the north. Keep going north and you're going to hit the North Pole before you hit another country other than Russia. So there it is. There's the Russians in Syria. They brought in fighter planes, troops. They've expanded some of the some of the airports to accommodate their planes. They've had submarine and surface ships rotating through the ports of Tartus and Latakia on the Syrian coast. So between Lebanon and Turkey in the north, there's a section of only about 60 or 70 k's, but just enough for Syria to have warm water ports, which the Russians have wanted for 200 years. Latakia Air Base, they're developing that. There they are, Latakia, Tartus, and one of the big military airports just outside Damascus and in other places through the country as well. Well, now that Trump has said, well, we're pulling all the troops out of Syria, we're going to get rid of them quickly. Then a few of his military people tapped him on the shoulder and says, can we change quickly to slowly? And apparently he's been persuaded, so he's gradually taking those troops out. But his plan, he said it before he was elected, he wanted to finish US involvement in the Middle East. He wanted to get the troops out of Afghanistan and out of Syria. His goal was to get all of them out. He said, we've spent trillions of dollars over the last 10 plus years. And what have we got to show for it but a lot of dead people? Nothing much else. Well, what he doesn't fully understand, of course, he hasn't maybe read Daniel chapter 11. He doesn't understand the implications of what's going to happen. And he's leaving the door open. If the US is there, the Russians have mercenaries, just like the Americans had a number of sort of ex-military specialists that would then join commercial organisations and did a lot of work in Afghanistan and in Iraq particularly. And Russia looked at that and said, that's not a bad idea, we'll do that too. So they formed mercenary groups that go in with their own troops, or instead of their own troops. And in Syria, there was a US air base, or a US base, with their Syrian allies, and over 200 of these Russian soldiers in the guise of mercenaries so that they could be denied, no, these aren't really Russian soldiers, but they were Russians, and they attacked this base. They were wiped out. The Americans just blew them away, wiped them out to a man, destroyed them all. They're a ferocious military power, but they're going. They're leaving. They're leaving a vacuum behind. Daniel 11 verse 40 speaks of the attack that will come finally through the Middle East, through Israel, down to Egypt, in an overwhelming rapid assault. It's like a whirlwind, the record says, with chariots, with horsemen, or the modern equivalent, with many ships. They'll enter into the countries, they'll overflow, they'll pass over. An irresistible power, that's the presentation of Daniel 11 verse 40. Unstoppable. And even Israel, with all its military power, and they're significant, they'll be swept aside. And Putin has set out over the last few years to redevelop the military strength of Russia. They don't have anywhere near the budget of America. They don't have anywhere near the income as a nation of the United States. But what do they care? They don't mind so much if people are suffering a little bit. They'll put their money into the military. And they're not like America, who has this vast budget but supports bases all over the world, supports soldiers who are being paid probably a darn sight more than Russian or Chinese soldiers are getting paid, and pensions and all the rest of it, all the fancy stuff that goes with it. Doesn't all just go into advanced weaponry, whereas Russia's very focused on what they spend their money on. With many ships, well, Sevastopol was the home port for Russia's Black Sea Fleet, and they were sort of there under sufferance once Ukraine took over that area, so they were leasing, if you like, that port from Ukraine. Until Putin said, well, I don't really like this situation, I think we should just get it back. It used to be Russian territory 100 years ago, why not again? So Russian troops moved in, they took over the Crimean Peninsula, drove out the Ukrainian army, who had no choice but to leave, either on foot or in a box. And so they now control the Crimean Peninsula and all the Ukrainian Navy vessels which were in port. He said, thanks very much, we'll take those too. So there's the Russians. At the time of the end, the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, chariots, horsemen, with many ships. And Russia, and China for that matter, are conscious of the enormous power projection of the Americans through their nuclear-armed or nuclear-powered aircraft carrier battle groups. You know, each significant aircraft carrier, there's about 13 of them in the American fleet, and there's about 6,000 men on one of those aircraft carriers. So if you can sink an aircraft carrier, you've killed 6,000 men in one go, and a few women too. And so the battle group consists of the aircraft carrier, the fighters and bombers and all the ordnance and the nuclear weapons which are on every American aircraft carrier. And all of those ships around it are there with one purpose and one only, and that's to protect that aircraft carrier. That's their function. Well, what if the Russians and the Chinese could develop missiles which could take out an aircraft carrier? What would that do to the American projection of power? If China had missiles, land-based missiles, which at a distance of 200 or 300 miles could sink an American aircraft carrier, and all of those defences were inadequate to stop that happening, what does that mean? Well, it's goodbye Taiwan for a start. But what it means is, of course, they won't send those battle groups any closer than 300 or 400 miles from the Chinese coast. They're forced back into the Pacific Ocean. And the same in the Mediterranean, the Persian Gulf, the Northern Indian Ocean, where they want to operate freely and where they've been able to intimidate with the aircraft carriers, with their planes and their nuclear missiles and all the rest of it. What if there was a threat which just set that aside? In a minute we'll look at that. So there's Crimea, which was taken over by the Russians, but of course the land connection is with Ukraine, and they can fly people in, or they've got to get ships that'll go from the Russian territory across the Sea of Azov, or they've got to come through the Black Sea, which means going through the Dardanelles. Very narrow, very dangerous, militarily very dangerous way to go. So Putin said, let's build a bridge. And he did. And they've now got a bridge which connects the Taman Peninsula with the Karch Peninsula. Connects the two. So now there's a land connection. The Crimean Bridge, or the Kerch Strait Bridge, was opened just last year, nearly a year ago. It's 18.1 kilometres long to span the straits. It's got a clearance of 35 metres. That's about the same as Sydney Harbour Bridge. So major ships can go underneath it. Putin can now supply his forces in Crimea not only by sea and air, but by road and by rail as well. And there's a significant number of people already using that bridge. They also opened and greatly expanded the Simferopol International Airport, which is about 30 or so miles from Sevastopol, the port city. And it's a magnificent airport. Beautiful terminal. Over 5 million passengers yearly is their estimate. It's already the 8th busiest airport in Russia. Amazing what they're doing. Well, that's what they're doing to consolidate their power in the Crimea, because the EU and the Ukraine, so that's Ukrainian territory, occupied by Russia. Russia says, that's Russia. That ain't part of Ukraine anymore. And they've taken steps to make it so. Well, they've developed, and this was in the press a month or so ago, their hypersonic missiles. And there was Putin out on the ocean observing the tests. And this missile, which can fly at 2 miles per second, 2 miles away, 2 miles away. 2 miles in 1 second, 2 miles away. That's faster than I can drive. Yeah, that's phenomenal. And Putin said, no one has hypersonic weapons yet, but we do. And the US military authorities have said, we don't know how to stop it. We have no effective countermeasures at the moment. Now you can be sure that they're working day and night, flat out, to develop countermeasures against it, but they may not succeed. These missiles may just prove to be unbeatable. It's almost like stopping a bullet in midair. It's just a phenomenal thing. They've got this super fast, super cavitating torpedo, they call it. So they have a gas production thing in the nose cone, which produces these bubbles, and gets the water out of the way, and the torpedo just goes flying through that water. China's developing this similar thing. Very much faster, 200 knots, 370 kilometres per hour for a torpedo. That is unbelievable speed. And again, what do? The advantage at the moment is it's very short range. It only goes about 10 k's before it runs out of steam. And they can't use sonar guidance to sort of get it back on track. So it's limited right now. But Russia is working on an improved version to have one which will go a lot further than 10 k's. So this is the sort of weaponry that they're bringing to bear. Just amazing. And meanwhile, US military are getting a pay rise because the defence budget went up by 70 billion, who knows? Huge amounts of money. 670 billion, I think, is their annual defence budget in the US. But they've got a lot of things to spend that money on before they even get to the weapons like that. Well, there's Europe, and there's the gas pipelines. We've seen pictures of these presented at current events nights before. But there's the percentages supplied by Russia, starting at 100% for the Eastern European countries. Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Latvia, all 100% of their gas comes from Russia. Bulgaria, Slovakia, Hungary, over 80% for each of those. Slovenia and Austria 60%, Poland 59%, Turkey 59%, Czech Republic 57%, Greece 56%, and Germany even 37%. And the European average 24%, so almost a quarter of all their gas comes from Russia. That's a pretty tenuous position to be in. And it's getting worse. You know, Russia's just about finalised, may have finalised the Nord Stream, the northern gas supply underwater pipeline, so they don't have to go through Ukraine and have the Ukrainians, who are their enemy now, turn off the tap. Well, the Ukrainians can't touch it. It goes underwater to the north. So, seeing all of this, Trump went to the NATO summit, and I watched it on YouTube, I think it was, with Trump in this meeting, and the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg sitting on the other side of the table, while Trump went at him for 20 minutes straight, just on and on and on about Europe not meeting their commitments, not having their 2% of GDP dedicated to military spending, relying upon America to spend their money to protect those countries. And Trump said, Germany, you've just signed up for this new deal with Nord Stream, and you're under the toe of Russia. Germany is totally controlled by Russia, was his comment. And you want us to defend you. And you've surrendered to the enemy already, in effect. He let them have it. They didn't like it. No US president ever spoke to them like that before, but Trump doesn't care. So he's insisting that the EU countries raise their military spending to the levels that they agreed to. They'd agreed before, yes, we'll have 2%, then they just didn't do a thing. And the other presidents in the past weren't game enough to say anything. Well, Trump did. And there's Russia on the eastern border, and you see these comparisons between Russia and NATO, and the NATO numbers are way ahead of Russia. You think, oh, well, they're not in a bad shape. But they're way ahead of Russia because of the United States. What if the United States doesn't come when they're called? What if the phone rings in Washington and Trump says, no, you're not paying your own way, you figure it out yourself. Now, I don't know if that'll happen, but... So here's the forces that Russia's got lined up on the border with Ukraine. Now, Ukraine is not a pushover. They've got significant forces and they will fight to defend themselves. 80,000 soldiers, 270 tanks, 180 armoured vehicles, 90 helicopters, 380 artillery pieces, 140 military aircraft, 19 ships, and they're just the ones on the border. There are tens of thousands more not far away. So Ukraine is in a tenuous position. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, well, Russia could run over them in a few days, and there'd be nothing they could do. I remember years ago there was an election being held in Finland, and some fellow who'd started a new party, and they asked him, what's your defence posture? Your defence budget is very small. He said, our defence posture is simply this: we'll have a tape recording that just says "we surrender" in Russian. Turkey is currently engaged in the biggest naval exercises in their history. All of their navy, virtually, in the Black Sea, the Aegean Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, all of the waterways all around Turkey. And many other military forces of Turkey engaged in that as well, not just the navy. And Turkey is a NATO member. In theory, they're on the side of the United States and the Eastern and the EU as part of the opposition to Russia. But all of that's changing. They're still in NATO. Nobody's game enough to upset the apple cart, and yet they're always turning to Russia for arms. They had a defence deal for missiles, the SS-400s. Now there's a second tranche that they're signing up for, and they are ending up in a position where they're alienated from the United States. The United States has got a very big air base in Turkey. I just wonder how long that'll be there. In Libya, there are these Russian mercenaries, they call them, 300 or so, operating in Libya and supporting the Libyan rebel group, which occupies, if you've seen much on Libya lately, there is the official government, which occupies half the country on the west, and there's this rebel group which occupies the eastern half, and they seem to be winning. And Russia is supporting them because they want some deep water, warm water ports for Russia in the Med. So Tobruk, we remember Tobruk, the Australians who fought there in the Second World War, and Dern, two ports on the eastern shores of Libya. In the Sudan, there are also Russian mercs operating there, carrying out training for the Sudanese military. And we go to Ezekiel 38, and there they are, Libya, Sudan, and Tagama, Turkey. So it's all coming together. We need to watch, we need to listen. Christ said, take heed, didn't he? We remember that, we read that earlier. Watch and pray always, that we might be accounted worthy to stand before the Son of Man. Because all of these things, as we look up and lift up our heads because our redemption is drawing nigh, that's true. It is. And every month and year that passes, we get closer. We keep saying that, but one day it'll happen. The day of Christ. That day, said Christ, will come. How are we going to respond to the words of our Lord?